What's gaming, gamers? Today, I've got a build for you using the Warlock exotic class Glaive Edge of Intent paired with the exotic arms armor Karnstein Armlets to grant you a near infinite restoration ×2 buff and an amount of survivability found on nearly no other melee build. But before I get into the build, I'd first like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us. The link is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me play games more often, come hang out with me on Twitch. I usually play Destiny or Overwatch over there, so if that interests you, the link for that is in the description as well. Now for the build itself. I'll first describe the Karnstein Armlets exotic arms armor as it's the centerpiece of the armor's setup, and I'll explain what the Edge of Intent Glaive does later in the video during the weapons section. As for the Karnstein Armlets, it has the exotic perk Vampire's Caress. Vampire's Caress will cause your melee and finisher final blows to grant you 3 stacks of the Cure buff as well as stacks of the Restoration buff depending on whether you get a melee or finisher kill. Melee kills will grant you 1 stack of the Restoration buff, and finisher kills will grant you 2 stacks of the Restoration buff. The Cure buff will instantly grant you 60 health per stack of Cure. As the Karnstein Armlets grant you 3 stacks of Cure, you'll be granted 180 health. Cure has an intrinsic 1-second cooldown, which means it won't activate more than once every second. However, the Restoration buff more than makes up for that slight loss in instant health uptime. With 1 stack of Restoration, you're granted 35 health per second while the buff is active, and with 2 stacks of Restoration, you're granted 50 health per second while the buff is active. Karnstein Armlets will grant you the Restoration buff for 6 seconds and refreshes itself to that 6-second duration whenever you get a melee kill or a finisher. If you have Restoration ×2, melee kills will refresh the duration of the Restoration ×2 buff. It won't revert to Restoration ×1. Now that I've described to you what the Karnstein Armlets do, I can get into the rest of the build, starting with the subclass. I'll put everything on screen first as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll describe what each subclass element does, why I've chosen it, and then go over any alternative options should there be any. For your super, run Well of Radiance. Run the Phoenix Dive class ability, whichever jump you prefer, the Celestial Fire melee, the Healing Grenade, the Touch of Flame aspect, the Heat Rises aspect, Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Searing, Ember of Singeing, and Ember of Solace. To detail the subclass, firstly, the super. Well of Radiance will grant you an effective invulnerability while within the well for its entire 30-second duration, in addition to a 25% outgoing damage boost. Well will be great for this build as a save if you find yourself taking more damage than you anticipated, or as a damage utility against mages or bosses if you decide to use it that way. Next, the Phoenix Dive class ability is chosen for its synergy with Heat Rises and its instant cure ability. Phoenix Dive, upon activation while in the air, will slam you to the ground and apply 2 stacks of the cure buff to you, healing you for 120 health. If Heat Rises is active, in addition to the 2 stacks of cure, Phoenix Dive will grant you 2 stacks of the restoration buff for 3 seconds and apply 40 scorch stacks to enemies within 5 meters of your landing spot. Phoenix Dive grants this build the ability to heal on command with the use of the class ability, as well as proccing the Restoration ×2 buff if used in conjunction with Heat Rises. For the melee ability, you can really use either the Celestial Fire melee or the Incinerator Snap melee. I choose to use the Celestial Fire melee as it's more of a ranged option in comparison to the Incinerator Snap, but both have their use cases and it's generally personal preference when deciding which one you want to use. The melee ability has no effective impact on the build itself, as it can't be used while your glaive is readied, so it's a fallback when your glaive is stowed or you need to apply quick scorch stacks to an enemy. For the grenade ability, the Healing Grenade is the grenade to choose. The Healing Grenade will be a significant boon for this build, as in combination with the Touch of Flame aspect, it will grant you 2 stacks of the Cure buff, which heals you for 120 health, as well as 2 stacks of the Restoration buff for 4 seconds. This is a significant source of instant healing, as well as another source of the Restoration ×2 buff, which can be continuously refreshed so long as you're getting kills with your Edge of Intent Glaive. Having this source of healing can be crucial to your survivability, as there aren't any melee damage boosting effects with this build, so taking out major enemies with your glaive can be a dangerous feat. Onto the aspects, firstly, Touch of Flame. Touch of Flame will be the most important aspect for this build, as it will enhance your Healing Grenade as previously mentioned. The most important thing Touch of Flame does is cause your Healing Grenade to grant you 2 stacks of Restoration, which can be continuously refreshed by getting kills with your Glaive's melee attacks. This can be used proactively, enabling you to proc Restoration ×2 and keep it going throughout an entire encounter so long as you're getting melee kills. The second aspect is Heat Rises. Heat Rises will grant you another way of being granted the Restoration ×2 buff, as while Heat Rises is active, using your Phoenix Dive class ability grants you Restoration ×2. Additionally, Heat Rises causes the consumption of your Enhanced Healing Grenade to grant you 3 stacks of the Cure buff, which will heal you for 180 health instead of using the Healing Grenade, which only grants 120 health. Admittedly, this is a negligible difference in healing given how much Cure and Restoration this build is already producing, but it is a difference, so I felt it worth mentioning. If you'd prefer the movement capabilities of Icarus Dash, you can choose to forego the Heat Rises aspect in favor of it. Icarus Dash is a really nice movement ability for either closing the distance to enemies or creating distance between enemies, so it's definitely a viable option if you'd prefer it. Onto the fragments, firstly, Ember of Empyrean. Ember of Empyrean will cause your solar ability and weapon final blows to increase the timer of your Radiant and Restoration effects by 4 seconds each. These buffs can only have a maximum effective timer of 12 seconds, but can be extended to this 12-second timer indefinitely. Ember of Empyrean doesn't affect your Glaive's melee ability, but it will allow your Glaive's projectile attack to extend your restoration timer. The Karnstein Armlets armor already causes your Glaive's melee to extend your restoration, so Ember of Empyrean simply means any Glaive heal you get will extend your restoration buff, not just its melee. Next, Ember of Searing will cause the killing of scorched enemies to grant you melee energy as well as generating fire sprites. The melee energy granted by this fragment isn't really useful nor necessary, but the generation of fire sprites can be. Fire sprites will, by default, grant you 12.5% grenade energy upon pickup. As of the release of the Season of the Wish, the specific grenade ability you choose will affect the specific percentage of energy granted by fire sprites. In the case of the healing grenade, the multiplier applied to the 12.5% default granted energy is 0.875. This means upon the collection of a fire sprite, you'll be granted 10.9% grenade energy. Fire sprites can only be generated once every 5 seconds, but their generation will help noticeably with your healing grenade's uptime. The third fragment is Ember of Singeing, which will grant you a 300% increase to your class ability's recharge rate for 3 seconds after having applied Scorch to an enemy. The buff can't be stacked with itself, but in combination with this season's artifact mods, scorching targets will be easy, allowing you to be granted this 300% recharge rate increase often. This will cause your Phoenix Dive ability to be off cooldown much more often, allowing you to be able to use it as a burst of healing much more frequently. Lastly, for fragments, Ember of Solace will simply cause any Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you to last 50% longer. This is beneficial as it allows you more time in between getting kills to refresh your buffs. The fragments I've just mentioned are specifically helpful for solo play. If you're playing with a group, running the Ember of Benevolence fragment is a no-brainer. Ember of Benevolence will cause the application of any solar buff to your teammates, as well as the revival of your teammates, to grant you a 400% increase to your grenade, melee, and class ability recharge rates for 6 seconds. The healing turrets summoned by Edge of Intent count for this fragment, as do your healing grenades, Phoenix Dive, and Well of Radiance, making this fragment incredibly helpful for group play when running this build. With the subclass build now detailed, I can get into the seasonal artifact mods to run if you're watching this video during Season 23, the Season of the Wish. As this season's artifact synergizes especially well with the Solar subclass, there are quite a few mods to run. I'll detail each one of them in succession, starting with Kindling Trigger. Kindling Trigger will cause the Radiant buff to grant your solar weapons the ability to apply Scorch stacks to enemies who aren't currently scorched. This means while you have Radiant, your Edge of Intent's projectile shots will apply Scorch to targets. This will proc both Ember of Searing and Ember of Singeing, allowing you to generate fire sprites to be granted grenade energy, as well as to be granted a 300% increase to your class ability's recharge rate. Next, the Flint Striker mod will cause rapid solar weapon precision hits and final blows to grant you the Radiant buff. This will be most effective with your heavy weapon, but can also be procced with your Edge of Intent Glaive's projectile shot. Having the Radiant buff active will allow you to scorch targets with your Edge of Intent's projectile shot via the Kindling Trigger mod, which will then proc both Ember of Searing and Ember of Singeing. The third and final artifact mod imperative to this build is Revitalizing Blast. Revitalizing Blast will cause bosses and champions to be affected by the Void Weaken effect for 6 seconds upon being damaged with the solar ability. Your melee ability, as well as your Phoenix Dive while Heat Rises is active, and your Well of Radiance will proc this mod, allowing you to deal 15% more damage to bosses and champions while the Weaken effect is active. With the artifact now detailed, I'll get into the armor setup for this build. I'll start with stat distribution, then get into a prescriptive setup for the armor's mods, and finally, I'll detail what each armor mod does, why I've chosen them, and any alternative mod options should there be any. For stat distribution, in the top 3 stat grouping of mobility, resilience, and recovery, spec into resilience and recovery somewhat equally with a slight bias towards resilience and ignore mobility altogether. Mobility on a warlock simply increases your walking movement speed and initial jump height, making it effectively useless for this build. Mobility does not affect your sprinting speed, and as you'll be sprinting between targets more often than walking or jumping between them, mobility is simply unimportant. Resilience, however, is very useful and is especially important on a Solar Warlock. Resilience governs both your total amount of health as well as your overall damage resistance. Each tier of resilience increases your overall damage resistance by 3% up to a maximum of 30% resistance at tier 10 resilience. Furthermore, resilience affects the health of your Well of Radiance's sword. It is for this reason I recommend having tier 10 resilience on all Solar Warlock builds if possible. On higher difficulties, bosses can shred your Well's health, destroying it and leaving you to the mercy of the boss with significantly less healing output. Next, recovery will govern the delay between receiving damage and the start of your health regenerating, as well as the rate at which you regenerate health. Additionally, recovery is the Warlock's class stat, which means the tier of recovery you have directly affects your class ability's cooldown. Recovery doesn't affect the restoration buffs at all. The health regeneration from restoration is uninterruptible, and its rate is dictated by the amount of stacks of restoration you have, not the tier of recovery you have. As such, recovery is important mostly for your class ability's recharge rate, as you'll have the restoration buff procced nearly indefinitely, making it less important than resilience. In the bottom 3 stat grouping of discipline, intellect, and strength, spec into discipline foremostly, with intellect and strength being equal in importance behind discipline. Discipline dictates the base cooldown of your grenade ability. Having higher tiers of discipline will cause your grenade's cooldown to be shorter, allowing you to use your grenade more often. As the healing grenade is both a source of the restoration ×2 buff as well as an instant cure if you need it, having your grenade off cooldown more often is very beneficial to this build's effectiveness. Next, intellect is an incredibly in-depth stat if you really want to get into the details, but I won't do that in this video. Simply put, intellect governs the rate at which you regenerate your super ability both actively and passively, with higher intellect tiers allowing you to regenerate your super faster actively, as well as lowering its passive cooldown. Intellect isn't too necessary for this build, as the Well of Radiance has one of the fastest base cooldowns in the entire game, as well as it not being too important for the build's overall effectiveness. Lastly, strength dictates the base cooldown of your melee ability, with higher tiers of strength correlating to shorter melee ability cooldowns. As you don't need your melee ability for much of anything with this build, and in fact can't use it while your glaive is rated anyways, strength isn't all that necessary for this build's success. My armor stats have me at 30 mobility, 100 resilience, 70 recovery, 70 discipline, 50 intellect, and 50 strength. As for the armor's build, I'll put all the mods on screen first as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer. Once I've done that, I'll get into detail about the mod setup, describing what each mod does, why I've chosen them, as well as any alternative mod options should there be any. For the prescriptive setup, on your helmet, run 1 harmonic siphon mod, 1 kinetic siphon mod, and 1 special ammo finder mod. On your arms, run 3 harmonic loader mods. On your chest piece, simply run whatever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. On your legs, run 1 Orbs of Restoration mod, 1 Recuperation mod, and 1 Solar Weapon Surge mod. Lastly, on your bond, run 1 Bomber mod, 1 Powerful Attraction mod, and 1 Reaper mod. To describe the mod setup in more detail, firstly, the helmets mods. The Harmonic Siphon mod will cause rapid solar weapon final blows to create an orb of power which will help your survivability and work towards generating both ability and super ability energy. The Harmonic Siphon mod only works with your Edge of Intense projectile shot and not its melee. This is why I choose to only have 1 Harmonic Siphon equipped, as it won't be procced all too often. Next, the Kinetic Siphon mod is simply for use with your kinetic slot weapon's final blows. You won't be using the kinetic slot weapon very frequently at all, but in the case that you do, this will help its synergy with the build. If you're running a stasis or strand weapon in your kinetic slot, run a stasis or strand siphon instead of the kinetic siphon, as that will correspond with your kinetic slot weapon's energy type. On your arms, the 3 harmonic loader mods simply serve to increase the reload speed stat of your weapon by 18 points, as well as granting you a 0.85 times reload duration multiplier. This noticeably increases the reload speed of your Edge of Intent, which does already have a decent base reload speed, but there aren't really any other arms mods that will help this build actively. You can choose to run mods like Impact Induction or Focusing Strike, but with Fire Sprites, fragments like Ember of Singeing, and armor mods like Orbs of Restoration, I don't feel these mods are as useful as the increased reload speed for your Edge of Intent provided by the Harmonic Loader mods. For your chest piece, simply running whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. This build doesn't make any significant use of armor charges, so charged up mods aren't necessary. However, if you don't need 3 resistance mods, you can run a Harmonic Reserves mod to increase the amount of ammo your Edge of Intent can carry. I do this in lower level activities frequently, as it's a nice quality of life improvement when you don't require 3 resistance mods. Furthermore, if you don't feel you need the resistance mods, you can run 2 Loosened Blade mods. These mods will cause your Edge of Intent's projectile shot to grant the weapon 30% increased energy gains, which reduces the total amount of shots required to get full energy from 4 to 3. This saves ammo in the long run, so it could be useful for you if you only require 1 resistance mod. Onto your legs, firstly, the Orbs of Restoration mod will grant your least charged ability a base 10% ability energy upon the collection of an Orb of Power. This is affected by the recent changes to ability tiers, and as such will grant your Healing Grenade 8.75% energy and your Phoenix Dive 8% energy when either of those abilities have the lowest charge. Next, the Recuperation mod will grant you 67 health upon the collection of any Orb of Power with no cooldown. This is effectively 1 stack of the Cure buff and will help boost your survivability just a little bit more. Lastly, the Solar Weapon Surge mod will grant your solar weapons a 10% boost to their damage while you have any stacks of armor charge. This only affects your Edge of Intent's projectile shot and not its melee attack, but it will also help to boost your solar heavy weapons damage, which is a useful boon to increase your boss damage capabilities. Alternatively, as the Recuperation mod isn't all too important with the amount of healing this build offers, you can swap it for any of the ability regeneration mods or a second Orbs of Restoration mod. I won't detail specific numbers for how much ability energy they regenerate because it would just take too long, but it would be a helpful boost to your ability uptime if you were to slot in one of these mods. Lastly, for your Bonds mods, the Bomber mod will grant you 10% grenade ability energy at base upon the use of your class ability. The Phoenix Dive ability applies a 0.6 times multiplier to this 10% figure, meaning Bomber will only regenerate 6% of your grenade's energy upon the use of Phoenix Dive, but this is still a noticeable increase to your grenade's uptime. It's not a mod to use actively, simply being a passive bonus whenever you happen to use your Phoenix Dive while your grenade isn't fully charged. Next, the Powerful Attraction mod will automatically collect any Orbs of Power within 12.5 meters of you upon the use of your class ability. Similar to Bomber, this isn't an active use mod and is simply a passive bonus to collect any Orbs of Power you may have missed nearby to you whenever you use your class ability. Lastly, the Reaper mod will cause any weapon final blow within 10 seconds of having used your class ability to summon an Orb of Power. This is simply an extra Orb of Power every once in a while and doesn't serve any significant purpose other than being an extra Orb of Power after the use of your class ability. With the armor build now entirely detailed, I'll get into some weapon perk recommendations, specific weapons that can roll those perks, and finally I'll describe the Edge of Intent Glaive and what it does. For weapon perks, I'll start in the kinetic slot. I prefer to run utility perks on weapons in this slot, like Shoot to Loot or Attrition Orbs, as well as ability regeneration perks like Demolitionist. Usually, I run a Shoot to Loot weapon, as it ensures I can collect ammo and Orbs of Power safely from a distance, as well as reloading all of my equipped weapons whenever I collect ammo bricks with the perk, which saves me from having to reload all too often. Specific Shoot to Loot weapons include the Lunulata 4B World Drop Bow, the Raconteur Bow from the Season of Defiance, the Hung Jury SR4 Scout Rifle from the Nightfall Weapon Pool, currently out of rotation, and the Battlescar World Drop Pulse Rifle. As for the heavy slot, running pretty much any solar weapon is recommended as it'll synergize with your subclass, armor mods, and the seasonal artifact this season. Rocket launchers synergize especially well with the artifact, while machine guns with perks like Incandescent synergize better with the subclass and armor mods. It's your decision which weapon archetype to run, but I'll still list a few specific weapons I recommend using. For solar rocket launchers, Ascendancy, which is requirable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the Tower, Apex Predator from the Last Wish raid, Hezen Vengeance from the Vault of Glass raid, and Roar of the Bear from the Iron Banner loot pool are all good solar rocket launcher options for use with this build. Apex Predator specifically is craftable, meaning you can get its pattern and put whatever role you want on it. For solar machine guns, Avalanche from the Dawning event, and Fixed Odds from the Duality Dungeon are all great solar machine gun options for use with this build. Fixed Odds is also craftable, meaning you don't have to rely on getting a good randomly rolled weapon. Now, onto the Edge of Intent Glaive. Edge of Intent has the exotic trait Restorative Turret, which allows you to consume your glaive's full energy in order to cause its next shot to deploy a healing turret at the location the shot lands. The healing turret deployed by Edge of Intent lasts 15 seconds and will shoot a healing seeker every 1.25 seconds that seeks out the nearest ally within 30 meters and grants them 1 stack of both the cure buff and restoration buff. The restoration buff granted by the healing turret lasts for 3 seconds, which can be affected by Ember of Solace and can be extended by Ember of Empyrean. As for the haft, magazine, and stock crafting options, I choose to run the lightweight emitter haft for its increases to reload speed and handling, the swap mag magazine for its increase to ready and stow speeds, and the short action stock for its significant increase to handling speed. The specific options you choose are personal preference, but I prefer having an increased handling speed to make swapping to my kinetic or heavy weapon, as well as back to my glaive, faster. With the entire build now detailed, I can get into some playstyle tips and tricks when you're using this build. Firstly, before you start your melee chain, it's usually a good idea to use your healing grenade to grant you 2 stacks of the restoration buff. This will heal you a significant amount over time. Your Karnstein Armlets will extend this restoration so long as you continue to get melee kills, and Ember of Empyrean will allow your solar weapons to extend the restoration duration as well. I like to save the Phoenix Dive for when I'm in need of cure in the middle of a fight, as using the dive will also proc the powerful attraction mod, which will collect all orbs of power nearby to you. As for the Edge of Intent's healing turret, I like to shoot it at the feet of higher health major enemies, as doing so will allow the turret to grant me cure stacks every 1.25 seconds while I melee the major with the glaive. Alternatively, you can use your glaive's projectile or your heavy weapon to deal with majors, but the healing turret is usually enough to allow your glaive's melee to deal with the enemy. The turret is important to use in those scenarios, however. As this build lacks any melee damage increasing buffs, the healing turret is an invaluable tool for surviving when your glaive's melee will struggle to kill enemies to proc the Karnstein Armlet's cure and restoration effect. But that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Again, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, the link to the Discord server is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me stream some games sometime, come hang out with me over on Twitch. The link for that is also in the description. If you have any questions or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Thank you for watching, and have a great day!